Thank you for inviting me. My name is, as was said, Carl Raning. I am a partner in Oliver Wyman Financial Service based in the Stockholm office. For those of you who don't know Oliver Wyman, we are a global management consulting firm specializing in financial service. We have worked in Iceland sort of directly in the aftermath of the crisis and then on and off since then. I've been asked to give some sort of external perspectives or outside-in perspectives on the Icelandic market and the sort of road to financial competitiveness. And as the Icelandic banks resolve most of the direct effects of the crisis, it's now time to really start looking at the sort of core operations and the business as usual and scrutinize those operations. And looking at the industry on a Nordic comparison, while it's very difficult to benchmark, we believe that there is some room for some radical restructuring for the Icelandic economy to sustain its banks and to change the perception of the financial market into something that is seen as very competitive. And we also believe that there are a number of policy-related decisions, but also some initiatives that the banks should consider. So looking at the current position, there was a recent study or survey by the World Economic Forum that looked at the financial market development ranking. Iceland scored number 68, which is quite far from the sort of top 10 ambition. However, on a positive note, the other Nordic countries are at least in the top 20 to top 30, suggesting that the Nordic model is quite competitive, also suggesting that also small countries can succeed in creating competitive climate on financial service. Then drilling in a bit into the survey and looking at what the respondents have said as the most problematic factors. There's no surprise that the capital control is on top of the list. Second on the list is access to financing, so the perception by businesses that there isn't enough access to financing. Other parts on the list are also very much policy related, but the access to financing, we think, is something that the banks can address. So access to financing, it could be sort of very strict covenants, no risk appetites, etc. But in these surveys, we see a very strong correlation between perception of availability of financial service and the perceived affordability of financial service. So you can see the Swedish countries here on the right, or the Nordic countries here on the right, where it's almost a one-to-one correlation between availability and affordability. So any move one can make to increase the affordability of financial service will likely address the other point as well. And a competitive financial center, of course, need sustainable bank returns. So putting them aside and considering that returns will stay the same, then we only have the cost base to work with and pass that through to the customers. Looking at three different cost drivers, so the operating costs, I will discuss today two initiatives. One is extending the use of shared infrastructure between the banks in the market. The second is cost reduction programs, and slightly different. I'll give you one example of what we see in Europe working better than other cost reduction programs. On the cost of funding, one observation is that Icelandic banks fund a much higher ratio of the balance sheets with equity, which is, of course, very, very expensive. Moving away from the standardized Basel models that are used to calculate capital into something that is more risk sensitive and allows the bank to shape their balance sheet into a more Nordic-like position. And then it's difficult to discuss affordability without mentioning the taxes. The taxpayers are the same as the customers, so there is clearly a direct link between affordability and the tax burden. And benchmarking the Icelandic economy is incredibly difficult. There are no other countries to compare with. There are, even in between the Icelandic banks, for an outsider, it's very difficult to really make sense what is part of the core operation and what is actually rests from the crisis. We've been looking here as a way of proxying. We've been looking at operating expenses over net interest income plus net fee and commission income as a proxy for cost income. And while it's not surprising, given the scale of the banks, that this ratio will come up higher than the Nordic peers. We have one peer set with large banks, so the Nordeas, the SEBs, and a smaller one with some of the savings banks, etc. The trend looks opposite from the other Nordic players. More interestingly, on the right is to split out and normalize the cost base, so looking how much cost do we have per unit of asset and what is the income per unit of asset. And here we can see a marked difference between the Icelandic institutions and the rest of the Nordics. And this suggests that scale is of high importance. It is and it's becoming increasingly expensive to run a bank and to have large-scale operation to split regulatory costs, IT costs, etc., is of high importance. And in order to generate scale in a market like this, we suggest that it should be evaluated to have much more shared services in between the banks. I know that there is some of this going on, but we have seen examples in other geographies where a lot of both the IT side, but also the back office and administration is sort of pooled together by the banks, and the banks continue or compete on the front end offering to clients. How do we treat our clients? What product range do we have? What prices do we have? So there is clearly a trade-off between competition and affordability, but we think with this model you could maintain competition or even increase competition, because if this structure exists, you can also invite smaller players to compete on the same platform. So in the Nordics, we have taken out 2 case studies here. So we have the BEC in Denmark. It's jointly owned by a subset of its clients. It's about 50 in total, mainly smaller banks across Denmark, but also some of the larger banks, so Nykredit, but also Swedbank, when they set up their operations in Denmark, they have used this structure, mainly focusing on IT services. So they have the different securities, capital markets platforms, etc. In Sweden, we have Sördo, slightly smaller player, jointly set up by Sparbanken Öresund and Sparbanken Syd, who are clearly competing in the same confined geographical market for the same customers. But here they have gone a step further, so they have the full banking platform, but they've also taken over some of the other back office, customer service, payroll services, etc., and do that jointly. The other point I wanted to make on cost is that almost every institution in Europe have 1 or 2 or 3 cost programs running at the moment. The ones that apply sort of a blanket cost-saving program, so everyone, please reduce your cost by 10%, or the ones that attempt some kind of leaning of current processes, etc. We've seen a much higher fail rate there, because Costs tend to crop back up as sort of the years pass. They just crop back up, and the lean approach sort of assumes that you're actually fundamentally doing the right process. Otherwise, you're just doing the wrong process, slightly less costly. So what we have seen working at many of the larger institutions is what we call zero-based cost programs. That sort of starts off with cataloging and benchmarking your current cost base in a lot of detail to understand processes, where the cost sits, etc. What you then do is a survival minimum assessment, which is basically thinking, what if we put our bank into runoff? What would we need? So we would probably need some IT skills, some accounting, some risk management, etc., but it's a pretty slim organization. And then follows a very detailed, deep, and sometimes quite uncomfortable strategy discussion, where one thinks through, where do we want to be in 5 years? What is actually our strategy for serving the customers in 5 years? Do we need a branch network to do that? And you sort of build up all the processes you need to support that strategy. So rather than starting where you are today, you start where you want to be. And then you develop a long-term plan to reach that target state. And it might include investing in certain areas to get to that strategy, but in what we have seen with many players is a sort of 25 to 40% cost reduction. These relatively busy slides is my attempt to discuss the sort of capital ratios in the market. So if we look at the dark blue, dark gray bar, that's the core tier 1 ratio. So core tier 1 capital over risk-weighted assets, which looks high, but not phenomenally much higher than the Nordic peers. However, if we look at the simplified leverage ratio, so core tier 1 capital over total assets, the picture is very different. So where the limit typically is at 4%, so you need to fund 4% of your assets with equity, the Icelandic banks are somewhere around 20%, which is of course very, very costly. And this has to do with the risk weight that the standardized models used for calculating this, how that behaves. And we've just done an example here to test the sensitivities. So if the Icelandic bank were to be able to reduce their risk weights, so the conversion factor between assets and RWAs, to the same level as these small regional peers across Nordics, so the average of those, that could have a knock-on effect and sort of allow the banks to reduce prices by 10% and still maintain the same return on equity. Given credit history, etc., it's not likely that that will happen anytime soon for prudential reasons, but having models that sort of reflect your true risk-taking at least allows the banks to sort of steer their balance sheet towards the risk position they want to have and get some sort of feedback to that. And the third point, although I don't understand Icelandic, I think this will be discussed today, so I won't dwell on it. We just did, again, a quick approximation that we're talking about another 10% of the price to customers that is driven by the bank taxes. And we've done a bit of a comparison against other European countries where the bank tax have been introduced. And it's clearly a market difference where Iceland is a lot higher. And also with a closed market as Iceland, there is no sort of, you're not taxing any foreign assets flowing to Iceland in the same way as the other countries will do. So it really is the sort of domestic taxpayers or tax beneficiaries that are also picking up the tab. So just to summarize these the discussion here. So we've done some pretty heroic assumption. I don't suggest that this is something that will happen in the short term, but just to test the sensitivity again. So on the operational cost, sharing infrastructure, doing cost program, assuming that the Icelandic bank could get halfway from where they are today to where the regional peer, the other small banks are. Also assuming that they could do the same with risk weights, so go 60% of the way from where they are today to where the regional small banks are. Also assuming that the core tier 1 ratio on average could drop from 24% to 19%, and assuming that the bank tax could be halved. And the potential reduction in sort of interest income is 25%, which is a pretty big difference and a pretty big impact on this affordability, and hence, with our argumentation, also with the availability of financial service in the country. Thank you.